Welcome to Philosophy with Xing, where we uncover the beauty behind philosophy. In today's episode, we'll be answering the question, since we cannot be sure of anything, we cannot say we know anything. So this is a claim that we need to either support or refute, or maybe even agree with some parts of the quotation while rejecting other parts of the quotation. So the statement makes two claims over here in our question statement. The first claim is that we cannot be sure of anything, which is interpreted to be humans not having absolute certainty of our knowledge claims. Because in this case, the first part of the quote is that we cannot be sure of anything, and this idea of sureness links to certainty. So we cannot be certain of our knowledge claims. So we cannot be absolute certain, but over here we can ask ourselves whether is it possible to be certain beyond reasonable doubt. So there's an extension here that you can discuss in your essay or in answering the question about whether it is possible to have certainty beyond reasonable doubt. Next part of the claim would be we cannot say we know anything. So that part of the quote is defined to be how humans are not able to hold justified true beliefs about some pieces of knowledge, where JTB is Plato's tripartite definition of knowledge, K for short. So the quote can be broken down into two claims. Alright, so this viewpoint of the question essentially echoes that of radical skepticism. And why is it radical skepticism? Because we cannot know anything. We cannot know anything. The second part of the quotation links to how radical skepticists think. So in our response to this quote, we can cite radical skepticism and the highly dangerous implications of solipsism. So what happens if we claim that we don't know anything? And also the highly dangerous consequences of solipsism, where it is the view that we cannot have any knowledge. So we can talk about essentially, let me erase the above notes. So solipsism and radical skepticism, we can talk about the dangerous implications of these two philosophical viewpoints. Alright, and while in my crafting of this essay plan, I can say I agree that we cannot be absolutely certain of our knowledge claims, which in effect is talking about how we cannot achieve absolute certainty. Why we cannot achieve absolute certainty? I would say because there are some limitations to our sources of knowledge, and also our theories of truth and justification. So I might agree that it is impossible to have absolute certainty, which is 100% certainty. You can be certain about something and your certainty will never waver. And I say that it's probably not possible to achieve absolute certainty because there are limitations to our sources of knowledge. Sources of knowledge include things like art, ethics, science, mathematics, what else? History, social sciences. So all these are our areas of knowledge. And our sources also talk about, for example, our experience, reason, testimony, memory, introspection. So there are shortcomings to these. And in like areas of knowledge, there is also shortcomings in the nature and methods of creating and constructing such knowledge. And of course, there are limitations to relying on experience, relying on reason, and of course, the fallibility of testimony and memory and even introspection that leads us to not be able to have absolute certainty about any kind of knowledge claim. However, I would say that this does not mean that we cannot have any knowledge. So we can still know things because we are able to achieve certainty within reasonable doubt. So although there are some limitations to our sources of knowledge, our areas of knowledge. Hold on, this is a little bit dark. This highlighter is a little dark. Okay, so although there are some limitations, but we are still able to achieve certainty within reasonable doubt. And if we are able to achieve certainty within reasonable doubt, then we can have knowledge. And this knowledge serves as a basis for other kinds of knowledge to be constructed. And by extension, we are able to know things. So in my response to this quotation, I would accept number one, which is we cannot be sure of anything. But I do not agree that accepting number one, which is the first part of our quotation, will automatically necessarily lead to the acceptance of number two. So essentially in this quotation, right, we're thinking that because we cannot be sure of anything, so we cannot say we know anything because of the use of the word since. So 1 and 2 have a causal link. However, while I agree that 1 is true, that we cannot be entirely sure of anything, but I will reject the second part, where we cannot say that we know anything is false, because we are able to be certain within reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, and from there we are able to build on our knowledge claims in order to know things by the definition of Plato's tripartite definition, which is justified true belief. So firstly, I will argue why in my response to the quotation, essentially. I would structure my argument as such. So firstly, I would argue why we cannot be sure of anything. And why we cannot have an absolute certainty. So, for example, most of our knowledge comes from a synthesis of reason and experience, as posited by Kant in the Kantian synthesis. So I will seek to argue why experience does not produce absolutely certain knowledge claims, and also explain why reason also does not produce absolutely certain knowledge claims too. So why we cannot be certain of anything is because our two main sources of knowledge, which is reason and experience, are not really able to produce absolutely certain claims. So there's some sort of a limitation to reason and experience. And why I'm only bringing up reason and experience in dissecting this quotation is because there is this Kantian synthesis, as I mentioned just now, where the Kantian synthesis essentially says that most of our knowledge comes from a synthesis of reason and experience. So that's why reason and experience will be the focus of argument 1. Alright, so experience as a source of knowledge is not absolutely certain because of the reliance of course, the highly fallible perception in collection of sense data. So first I'll be explaining like why is it that experience is not very reliable in allowing us to attain absolute certainty. That's because of our highly fallible sense of perception. And since experience is greatly dependent on collection of sense data, so if your sense data is already fallible and flawed, then the knowledge that you gain through the source of knowledge being experience and through inferring through sense data, it's natural that your knowledge gained from experience might also not be absolutely certain. So even though we are able to okay, this is arguable, but some may say that we are able to access the external mind independent reality, which is the real world outside, although there are some philosophers who think that we are only accessing we're not directly accessing reality per se. However, if we were to assume that we could directly access reality around us, there are also other things that come into play, like optical illusions. Like, for example, the optical illusions like the Amy's window troubles people in carpentered societies. So, and also another example of an optical illusion would be a stick appearing bent when placed in a glass of water. So these are examples of how our perception can deceive us. So because our perception can deceive us, then if I were to look and rely on experience alone to look at a cup and the cup so happens to have a stick in it, then I can say like, oh, if a stick is placed into water, the stick will bend. And if we were to get knowledge from experience alone, that would be a highly problematic, as we know that sticks don't bend in water. So there definitely must be something more to complement experience in that sense. So anyway, going back to experience alone as a source of knowledge, our observations of the external world may be fallible and also uncertain. So at the same time, you can also bring in another philosopher, Descartes, and his evil demon argument. So what does his evil demon argument say? His evil demon argument essentially explains that an evil demon could be deceiving our senses right now. And if the evil demon is deceiving our senses, then what makes our senses reliable? And Hilary Putnam also further buttresses this claim because he proposes his brain in a vat argument. So beyond talking about Descartes, you can also talk about Putnam's brain in a vat argument. So this brain in a vat argument is essentially explaining that we are all brains in vats and there's no external reality independent of our minds existing. So some people, on top of citing philosophers, can also cite real life in how our perception is fallible. For example, some people might have biological defects like red-green color blindness. And that distorts our perception of the external reality, and this exacerbates the problems of perception. So of course, there are indeed limitations to the philosopher's evil demon argument and the brain in a vat argument, because they do sound highly improbable, because if we were in a simulation or being deceived, surely we would be able to detect inconsistencies in our reality. So we could easily refute Descartes and Putnam's arguments by saying that if indeed we were in some sort of simulation, there would definitely be some kind of inconsistency. And why do we say that? Well, we can also think of the Truman Show and how there were some inconsistencies in the main character's reality that led him to question whether or not this reality actually existed, or it was just a simulation, or it was just a setup for him. Alright, so there's also advancements in technology, and it seems that issues with color blindness could be mitigated. So this could be mitigated by technology. So problems of perception are actually being mitigated today through technology, through certain arguments about reality and how there isn't really an inconsistency in our reality. So it could be that problems of perception are mitigated. However, that doesn't mean that problems of perception cease to exist just because there are advancements. So I will still continue to further argument 1 to say that despite all these mitigations, problems of perception still exist. And I can use certain philosophers to support my idea that problems of perception still exist despite mitigations. So essentially you can see that my line of reasoning here is I have an argument, and then I explain it by citing philosophers, and then I would cite mitigations and flaws to the philosopher's arguments in order to further make my line of reasoning stronger. And then finally, I would reiterate my arguments so I do not clash with my or contradict with my original stand, and further cite some theories to support my argument once more. So over here we are at this stage, which is to further cite theories, because I'm reiterating my argument that despite some mitigations of problems of perception still exist. So why is that so? So there's a theory posited by Kant that we are all wearing green glasses, and certain other philosophers also support this to say that there's actually a filter between external reality and our mental faculties. So Kant further asserts that due to the noumena-phenomena distinction, we can only access the phenomena which is once removed from noumena. So we can never directly access reality. So those were the philosophers that I was talking about just now, where ultimately they do think that we cannot directly access reality. So that would be Kant and his noumena-phenomena. And as such, we can never directly access reality, so we can never be truly absolutely certain about knowledge claims that are derived solely from experience. So because I've talked so much about experience and how experience only provides the sense data, so of course how we create knowledge today is not only blindly believing what our senses tell us. There's also the element of reason that complements experience. So we will go on to talk about reason and its limitations. So that would be in support of argument 1, because you can see in argument 1 I was also mentioning reason as highlighted above. So we'll go on to talk about reason. So experience only provides the sense data which reason interprets and produces knowledge claims. So the use of reason in producing a posteriori knowledge from experience also gives rise to knowledge claims that are not absolutely certain in the construction of a posteriori knowledge from experience. And also in this construction of knowledge from experience, inductive reasoning is also employed by abstracting observations about the empirical world into generalizations about the external reality. So this is quite these are like two different lines of reasoning that I am using. So firstly, reason's role in experience is to complement experience for us to rationalize sense data. And at the same time, even if we are rationalizing sense data, we're not able to be absolutely certain of our rationalizations. Why is that so? It's because of the use of inductive reasoning. And of course, in a previous videos, I did mention the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is essentially saying that if we were to abstract into the future, there's no 100% certainty that essentially our predictions or knowledge of the future will necessarily be true. And that's especially relevant in science. So inductive reasoning is employed in abstracting observations about the empirical world into generalizations about the external reality, and there are problems with inductive reasoning. Even if observations in terms of sense data are accurate reflections of reality, the use of inductive reasoning leads to the knowledge claims produced falling prey to, once again, the problem of induction. And for this you can cite Bertrand Russell. So the problem of induction posits that we cannot be absolutely certain about our predictions of the future based on what has happened in the past. So you can cite Bertrand Russell in this. Just because the sun has always risen in the east does not necessarily mean it will continue to rise from the east tomorrow. So since all knowledge claims obtained from experience and rationalized with inductive reasoning fall prey to the problem of induction, we cannot be absolutely certain about those claims. So there's no absolute certainty. So now in argument 2, we talked about how reason is complementing experience. So the reason's role in complementing experience also makes knowledge not absolutely certain. Then how about if reason were to be a source of knowledge by itself without complementing experience? So some areas of knowledge could be like mathematics, where you use a deductive reasoning from a basic mathematical axiom. So in this argument, we will consider knowledge claims that are constructed purely by reason. And I would argue, in my line of reasoning, that we cannot be absolutely certain about most knowledge claims obtained through reason as well. So when knowledge claims are absolutely certain, they are not entirely useful in the expansion of our wealth of knowledge. So this argument can go both ways. The first one is that we cannot be absolutely certain as well if we were to use reason purely as a source of knowledge. But at the same time, even if the knowledge was absolutely certain, it's not useful. And so even if we were to know things and be sure of it, we wouldn't know much. So that would go back to our initial quote, which is, since we cannot be sure of anything, we cannot say we know anything. Right? So for this part, a priori knowledge that is absolutely certain include tautologies and syllogisms. So statements like all bachelors are unmarried men have the predicate contain the subject and hence are truth preserving, although they are circular, due to them being true by definition. On the other hand, syllogisms, such as the claim all men are not women, so John is a man, hence John is not a woman, is also a truth preserving line of reasoning because of the conditional logic involved, which assumes the premises are true. So while these deductive statements are, well, indubitable, they are largely not useful in adding to more knowledge about our world because of the analytic a priori nature. So even if our knowledge is certain, like syllogisms, tautologies, but they're not really very useful because they're all circular by definition. Circular by definition, I mean true by definition, and they don't really add much to our knowledge of the world. And if we were to consider other forms of a priori knowledge, like synthetic a priori knowledge, which is a term coined by Kant, while they increase our knowledge, they are far less certain. So one area of a priori knowledge is that of, well, mathematics. So just now I said that mathematics could be absolutely certain, but there are some philosophers that also argue that mathematics might not be entirely certain. So math is synthetic a priori because math relies on axiomatic deductive reasoning, which is established by Euclid. So the fundamental axioms are crucial to axiomatic deductive reasoning and are not always true. So some of the axioms in Euclid's postulates, in Euclid's elements, are indeed quite true, but there are some of Euclid's postulates that cannot really be proven. So we cannot be always certain about reason or knowledge derived by reason as well. So for example, Euclid's fifth parallel postulate. It holds that it only holds true in Euclidean geometry, but not in Riemannian geometry. So the Gödel's, and in addition, the Gödel's incompleteness theorem is a rebuttal against Herbert's program that sought to formally axiomatize mathematics. And this also highlights how math, heralded as one of the most certain areas of knowledge, is also uncertain. So another example, as I just now cited, is the Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which shows that math is not entirely certain. So because of that, we cannot really have absolute certainty. So in my line of reasoning, I've gone from experience, which is quite fallible because of our propensity to be deceived by optical illusions, to even the most certain, which is reason, and how even reason might not be absolutely certain as well. So I've already addressed the first part of my quote, which is that we can never be sure. We cannot be sure of anything. So yes, we cannot be absolutely certain because we've gone through the entire spectrum from things that are obviously not that certain to things that, or areas of knowledge that might be really certain. So if we were to go to examine like memory, testimony, and introspection on a side note, because in this line of reasoning, I'm only mostly talking about reason and experience. If we were to examine memory, testimony, and introspection as well, we also cannot obtain absolutely certain knowledge. For example, memory is fallible, as we could be actually recalling not the event that happened in the past, but a recollection of the last time we recalled the event. So if you think about perhaps your high school graduation, you're actually not recalling the actual event, but your past memory of the event itself. So you're not directly accessing the past to attain like absolutely certain knowledge of the past. Similarly, in testimony, misunderstandings in language driving testimonies could also lead to fallibilities in knowledge transmission. And introspection is also fallible due to the possibility of ignorance and error in making introspective judgments about our own conscious experience, as espoused by the unreliability thesis by Eric Schwitzgebel. So it appears at last that our knowledge claims are actually not absolutely certain. Yeah, so we've gone the entire round to explain why it is not entirely certain. So beyond the fallibilities of sources of knowledge, we can also not be certain about our knowledge claims due to some limitations of justification in countering certainty to our knowledge claims, in conferring certainty to our knowledge claims. So remember in my topic thesis of sorts, I talked about how there are limitations to sources of knowledge. So I'm looking at this part here, underlining that right now. And I'm done with that from A1 to A3. And now I'm going to talk about the theories and how these theories are limited in allowing us to produce absolutely certain knowledge. So that would be argument 4. And in argument 4, we can raise the idea about justification and its problems. The first problem I can think of is the Agrippan trilemma, which best encapsulates the limitations of justification by asserting that coherentist justification falls prey to circularity of reasoning. Foundationalist justification falls prey to infinite regress. And the reliabilist theory of justification is dogmatic. So the definition of reliable is also arbitrary and open to inquirer's interpretation, resulting in possible dogmatism that one's method of constructing knowledge is necessarily reliable compared to another's. The foundationalist justification raises the question about how one can determine when one's knowledge claim is foundational, as we can keep questioning the support for each claim and descend into infinite regress. So if we were to keep asking why, we would find ourselves spiraling into infinite regress. So there's actually no foundationalist basis for knowledge claims. Okay, furthermore, since coherence can exist in a web of beliefs, a web of false beliefs, and even in a web containing true and false beliefs, coherentist justification is inadequate in providing sufficient grounds for holding a belief. So if I were to go into the Harry Potter universe, the Wizarding World, all my knowledge claims about the Wizarding World can cohere with one another. For example, if I were to use a wand and do some spells, things would happen. And that means that this thing is necessarily true because we can see it happening. And there's a lot of elements of the Wizarding World that all add up together. However, all this is obviously fictional, and if we were to rely on coherentist justification in order to justify our knowledge claims, then certainly it would not be absolutely certain that our knowledge claims are necessarily justified, because we can be living in a web of false beliefs. And even worse, it could be in a web containing both true and false beliefs. So extending the flaws of coherentist justification to coherent truths, so now I'm going beyond justification to talk about theories of truth. Coherence may also not lead to truth for reasons similar to those arguing against coherentist justification due to its circularity. So there are limits of justification and truth which undermine the certainty of knowledge. So I have proven that we cannot be absolutely certain about our knowledge claims, but that does not mean that we consequently cannot have knowledge. Because although absolute certainty cannot be attained, certainty beyond reasonable doubt can be attained, which is sufficient for us to hold knowledge claims. So for the theories of truth, I only talked about the coherentist theory and how it is similarly very circular. similar to coherentist justification. So my sixth line of argument is to talk about how, although we cannot attain certainty, absolute certainty, we can have certainty beyond reasonable doubt. So I argue that certainty beyond reasonable doubt can be attained through employing a combination of theories of justification. So the limitations of one theory of justification can be complemented by the strength of another to provide justification for a knowledge claim. For instance, the claim that the cross product of perpendicular vectors is equal to 0 coheres within the Euclidean system of geometry and has foundationalist justification by Euclid's axioms as laid out in his Elements. So this shows that the theories of justification can complement each other to accord certainty within reasonable doubt to a knowledge claim. So although alone, each of the theories of justification may be flawed, but when employed together, they might confer a greater degree of certainty to knowledge claims. So here I mentioned employing a combination of theories of justification. J for short. Second, we can also acknowledge the limitations of our sources of knowledge and strive for relative certainty rather than absolute certainty, while maintaining absolute certainty as an epistemic ideal for knowledge. Certainty beyond reasonable doubt is sufficient for us to hold knowledge claims because of the benefits holding knowledge claims has over being a solipsist. So here we're talking about two different things again. One of the things is that we should strive for absolute certainty as an ideal. Ideal means that you might not necessarily achieve it, but it is an ideal. And we can settle, so plus we can settle for relative certainty because realistically, it is not entirely possible to achieve absolute certainty. And why we can settle for relative certainty is because this relative certainty is better than just being a solipsist. Pragmatically, it is epistemically futile to reject all knowledge on the basis that it is uncertain, or that it would cast the world into complete doubt. And we cannot use knowledge to serve its practical purpose. So, why is it better? It's because of pragmatic reasons. For instance, knowledge about medicinal science is useful in saving the lives, and just because it could be flawed due to problems of induction, which plagues all a posteriori forms of knowledge, does not mean we completely disregard medical knowledge and contribute to the deaths of ill people. It is also productive to have knowledge so that we can understand the world around us. Hence, although we cannot be absolutely certain about our knowledge claims, we are still able to have knowledge. So that part of the argument would be essentially talking about how I'm addressing this second part over here. You can see we cannot say we know anything. So just now, argument 6 to argument 7 is addressing how despite us not being able to achieve absolute certainty, we are still able to have some knowledge and we cannot say that we don't know anything. And once again, for your conclusion, you can just reiterate your stance. And perhaps you can link to some greater ideas about what knowledge brings to humanity. For example, definitely our knowledge could be an end in itself. It could also be a means to an end. For example, in the example of architecture or medicinal science, it's about trying to help society become better. So with that in mind, we certainly cannot say that although we cannot be sure of anything, we cannot say that we don't know anything, because it simply is not the case in reality, on top of all the arguments that philosophers have cited as well over centuries. Alright, so that marks the end of our discussion for today. Thank you for watching and goodbye.